Hello, my name is MaxKrasnow, and I teach at Harvard University in the Division of Continuing Education. I studied psychology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and stayed there to earn a PhD in developmental and evolutionary psychology. I've taught several courses on evolutionary topics for students from high school to graduate school, and this upcoming course I will be teaching is an introduction to evolutionary psychology. Most people haven't heard of evolutionary psychology, and most people aren't sure what academic psychology is really all about either. When you hear that someone's a psychologist, what do you think that they do? Most of the time when I tell someone I'm a psychologist, they think that I'm a clinical therapist, someone who helps patients with their mental health concerns. And this is the first thing that students usually discover about the field of psychology. Clinical psychology and academic or research psychology are not the same thing. A clinical psychologist is licensed to work with patients. An academic psychologist is trained to do research. Of course, some of that research might be applied, like research on which psychotherapy method is most effective at treating a particular mental health concern. Most research, though, is basic research. Research designed to help us understand how the mind and brain work. Psychology is often seen as a hub discipline, an area of study that connects to many other areas of study. For instance, the brain processes information, and so cognitive science, computer science, machine learning, and artificial intelligence are all related to psychology. The brain is also a biological system of neurons and neurotransmitters. It's the developmental product of our DNA. And so biology, neurology, genetics, and chemistry are all related to psychology. The brain produces the mind, and the mind produces our behavior, how we act when we're alone or in a crowd, in person or online. And so psychology is related to sociology, economics, marketing, communication, the rest of the humanities. Maybe most fundamentally, psychology studies the mind, and we have minds, so psychology is often just inherently interesting, even to the general public. You might be wondering, though, why do we need a science of psychology, and why do we need to think about evolution and natural selection as part of that science? To answer that, I think we need to first ask, why do we need science at all? We look around ourselves every day and understand many things without science. Or at least we feel like we do. Take the waves that we see in the ocean. Standing on a beach, there doesn't feel like there's anything mysterious about these waves. They seem regular, predictable, simple. But if you had to write out a model of that wave's behavior, what would have to go into the model? What are the causes that make waves have the motion that they have? You could start out thinking about water as a mass that is acted upon by gravity, and remember that the sun, earth, and moon all have gravitational pulls that are likely to be involved. You might think about how these gravitational forces aren't static, but dynamic, as the moon orbits around the earth, and the earth around the sun. You might think about how the earth spins as it orbits, and how this spin likely affects the wind, and the weather, and thus the waves. You might also think about how water in the ocean isn't all the same everywhere. Some parts are lower or higher temperature, lower or higher salinity, and thus lower or higher viscosity. You might then think about how the ocean floor isn't the same everywhere, and about how waves really only seem to crest when they're near certain kinds of beaches. So having considered these causes, how would you then relate them all together? Is it as simple as adding them all up? Probably not. In fact, the model can get quite complicated, even for something simple, like predicting the speed of waves on the surface of water. And even this model isn't complex enough because we need a totally different model to get the speed of waves that are driven primarily by wind. Now, this isn't a class on fluid dynamics, of course, but I think you'll agree that human behavior is probably a little more complicated than ocean waves. That's why we need science. The world, including the waves in the ocean and the people swimming in it, is a complicated causal structure. And while we can use our eyes and other senses to observe it, some of the causes, like the moon and its gravity, are just going to be too hard to see with our naked eyes. And even for the things that we can see, we shouldn't necessarily trust our eyes to tell us the truth. Take this image, for example. Your eyes are telling you that the square marked A is darker than the square marked B. But when I put this mask over the image, you can see that they're actually the same shade of gray. What gives? Well, your visual system uses the context of the image to infer that B is in shadow while A is not, and it adjusts your perception of the underlying color. While that's useful for some things, it does give you systematically wrong information about the shade that's actually arriving to your eyes on your retinas. And this is not simply a light versus dark phenomenon. Take this girl here, who so clearly has black pupils in each of her eyes. But if I mask out the rest of the image again, you can see that they're actually red and blue, not black at all. Again, your visual system is giving you systematically biased information about what's there in the world. And it's not simply about color either. Take this image, which so clearly looks like a spiraling shape that's spiraling into or out of the center of the screen, right? But if I put up these red circles for reference, you can see that what you actually thought was a spiral is simply a set of concentric circles. So your visual system can give bad information about both color and shape. Interesting. Now take this display, which is so clearly in motion. But then flick your eyes to wherever you see motion on the screen and notice that it suddenly stops. That's because this is really just a static image. There is no motion. But you perceive motion there nonetheless. Lest you think this is just a problem with human vision, maybe because we spend so much time looking at screens, let's try this experiment out on a different species, like this cat. It looks like this is something about vision more generally. Now, while these illusions are fun, I use them here to make a point. That isn't how vision feels, right? If you consider how it feels to experience vision, it feels simple. It feels like the world is out there waiting to be seen, that we open our eyes and see it, and by seeing it, we get a picture of the world in our head. And if you thought this, you wouldn't be alone in thinking that vision was so simple. About 50 years ago, as AI and computational robotics were really taking off, a leading professor at MIT shared the hunch that vision was simple, so simple in fact, that he assigned an undergraduate the task of getting a computer to see over the course of a summer. Not sure that undergrad was ever seen again. It's almost 50 years later, and we still don't have machines that can see the way that people can. Sure, they can take pictures. They can categorize a handful of objects, like faces. and they can do some individual recognition within a category, like recognizing one person's face as different than another's. But it's almost 50 years later, and the problem of human-like computer vision is still unsolved. Over and over, this pattern has repeated itself in robotics and artificial intelligence. What feels consciously easy or transparently simple often relies on an immense, complicated, hidden structure. On the left, we have how vision feels. On the right, we have a wiring diagram of all of the high-level connections between brain areas that you would need to include to actually model human vision. Not how it feels, is it? So that's why we need science. The world is complicated in ways that we can't see, and we can't use our personal experience of it as a guaranteed way to understand it. But by using the scientific method, we have a tool that we can use to actually discover the true causal structure of the world. You know the scientific method, of course. The simple version goes something like this. You observe a phenomenon of interest, something that you want to explain. You propose a theory of why it happened, usually based on what you already understand to be true. You then collect some data from an experiment to test the theory's predictions. And then, if the predictions were wrong, you revise the theory in the light of those data. This much most middle schoolers would likely be able to tell you. But the question that seldom gets asked at this point is what makes a good theory in the first place? What kinds of theories are useful for using the scientific method to drive us towards the truth? To think about this, let's consider a phenomenon that most people have some kind of theory about, the obesity epidemic. Now, to be clear, we're not talking about healthy levels of weight, and we're not trying to fat shame anyone. The problem is, lots of people around the world and in the US have weight levels that contribute to mortality and chronic disease, and this is one of the drivers of why the US spends more on healthcare than other countries do, even as a percentage of our GDP. And this isn't a problem that we've been ignoring. We've spent billions of dollars on health research trying to confront this epidemic. $5 billion just from 2012 to 2016, which is comparable to what we've spent on other major efforts like heart disease, diabetes, and breast cancer. And we tried some pretty big interventions like outright banning the sale of large sugary drinks and encouraging healthy eating in children. But as you can see by this prevalence, this is still a pervasive problem that, despite all the spending and effort, is really not going away. Why? Why aren't we revising our theory of the causes of obesity in the face of this data that shows us that our predictions were wrong? That's weird, right? But what is the theory behind the interventions that seems to be failing so spectacularly? If I had to guess, it's something like this. You have people's food choices, which are bad, and the reason they make bad choices is because they like or prefer all that junk food. That's what you must think if you think that banning sugary drinks would be a good policy. But what's wrong with this theory? Notice, how do you figure out what people's food preferences are in the first place? Why are we so sure that their preferences are so strong? To know that, we'd have to look at what they choose to buy and what they would choose to buy instead of something else, right? This circular logic suggests that what we have is a merely descriptive theory, not a causal theory that's actually doing predictive work. So what would a better theory look like? Here's one that just might be better. This is a theory developed by Stephen Gollin, an anthropologist, and William Lassick, a medical doctor. This essential fat scarcity theory starts with the fact that our brain is a very fatty organ. In fact, half of the brain's dry weight is fat, and 20% of the fat is not just any old fat, but a special class of molecule called LC-PUFA, long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acid. Now that might not be too big of a problem, except that these fats are scarce, and in our modern diet, they make up less than 1% of the calories that we consume. We can't really taste the difference between LC-PUFAs and other fats at the level of our tongues, which is a problem if we needed to seek them out. But our bodies can certainly detect whether it's digesting enough of this important fat when it's trying to maintain our brains. Because of these facts, this theory proposes that we've evolved a diet choice mechanism that craves fat consumption until the body detects that our LC-PUFA needs are met. So what makes this a better theory instead of merely a different theory? It's better because it actually makes tons of testable predictions. If this theory is true, then we should look around the world and see that obesity is highest in places that have low amounts of LC-PUFA in their diet. That is, across countries, we should find that those with the lowest ratio of LC-PUFA have the highest average body mass index. And that's in fact the case. Actually, this one variable accounts for the majority of variance in obesity rates across these countries, which is a fact that dietitians previously didn't know. This theory also predicts that LC-PUFAs should collect differently on the bodies of men and women. Why? These fats are not for energy, they're for making brains. And while a man only ever has to make his brain, if a woman is going to have children, she's going to need more LC-PUFA than him. Now, most animals don't have a sex difference in fattiness. In fact, other primates don't have that sex difference either. But humans have a sex difference in fattiness, even from our earliest ages of life. And as you can see, the difference explodes at puberty, right at the age when making another brain starts to be a possibility. Of course, if you're going through all the effort to collect that scarce fat, you should keep it and not burn it for energy, right? Only using it for making brains. In a huge data set of tens of thousands of women in the US, this is in fact the case. LC-PUFA is preferentially stored on the hips and thighs, so what we should see is hip and thigh fat dropping as women have more children. In contrast, waist fat has almost no LC-PUFA, so we should see no drop as women have children. And that's exactly what we see. Compared to women who have never been pregnant, women lose hip and thigh fat for every child they have. But they don't do so for fat around their waist. And that LC-PUFA shouldn't just go nowhere, it should actually be going into the child's brain, right? And that's also what we find. In that same dataset of tens of thousands of women and their children in the US, women who had more hip and thigh fat relative to waist fat, that is, a lower waist-to-hip ratio, when they gave birth, their children scored higher on intelligence tests decades later on. These results are scores on 3 different tests of diverse mental abilities, like verbal ability, math, and spatial reasoning. And yes, you heard that right. Mom's waist-to-hip ratio while that baby was gestating predicts that child's intelligence decades later. Now, if that hip and thigh fat that's so important for making brains is consumed as a woman has children, that makes the hips and thighs a potent source of information that should matter for the kinds of mate choice mechanisms that could evolve in men. That is, we should see a reliable pattern where women are judged as reliably more attractive when their waist is small relative to their hips. Here's just one data set of many that support that prediction. Compared to that same representative sample of women in the US, fashion models, women who've been selected on the basis of their attractiveness, have reliably lower waist-to-hip ratios. That is, this essential fat scarcity theory is a better theory because, based on the causal mechanisms inside the theory, it makes predictions that connect out to the rest of science. This theory makes predictions in the fields of nutrition and health, in demography, in biochemistry, in human psychology, and so on. This is the mark of a truly causal model. Now, in the natural sciences, what is our most basic causal model? In many ways, the answer to that question is adaptation by natural selection. In the absence of selection, in a physical world that's simply governed by the laws of physics and chemistry, you don't get complex organization to occur reliably. Sure, if you look across the universe, you can see collections of matter, but this isn't organization at anywhere near the level of complexity that occurs in a biological organism, for example, that occurs in your eye. In each of your eyes, you have over 100 million rod cells, and in each of those rod cells, you have hundreds of millions of rhodopsin molecules. What's so special about rhodopsin, you ask? Well, this molecule changes its shape in less than 1/1,000,000,000th of a second, and it does that when it's impacted by one photon of light. That is, it reacts at just about the physical limit of speed to the physical limit of the amount of light that can physically exist. This is the perfect molecule to use to detect light for the purpose of vision. And this molecule isn't uniformly scattered around the universe, and that it's in your eye simply because of its prevalence. It's concentrated in your eyes and my eyes, in the eyes of every human, and indeed the eyes of every vertebrate. Now that's reliable complexity. Moreover, that's the kind of reliable complexity that you just don't get by random forces interacting with each other. But if designs replicate, and some designs replicate faster or more than others, then over time, those designs will be the ones that come to predominate in the population. That's it. That's all natural selection is. It's the simple idea that if you have designs that replicate, those that replicate at higher frequency will grow in frequency, as if there was a force selecting for them. And natural selection is actually the only force in nature that can reliably produce complex design. And that reliability is important. The fact that designs are reliable across the species means that we can study human anatomy as one thing, as opposed to needing to study John's anatomy, Steve's anatomy, Luke's anatomy, Jesse's anatomy, Steph's anatomy, and so on. And it's the same with psychology. Psychology is the science of those designs in the mind, brain, and behavior that reliably occur in humans. Therefore, we can think of psychology as the science of how natural selection designed the brain. Now, over the past 20 years, I've started from this basic starting point to work on several different research programs. For my PhD dissertation research, I was interested in a pattern of results in the field of spatial cognition. For over 70 years, psychologists have found that men tend to have better abilities than women in a handful of spatial tasks, like navigating around a known environment. Evolutionary psychologists expect that when ancestral men and women faced similar selection pressures, we should end up with similar adaptations. And it's only when we faced reliably different selection pressures that would cause us to predict a sex difference to show up. There's actually pretty good evidence that our ancestors did face different selection pressures relating to navigation, particularly with ancestral men hunting animals relatively more than ancestral women did, and ancestral women gathering plant foods relatively more often than ancestral men did. A common proposal was that this spatial advantage that men had was due to this focus on hunting, which requires navigating over larger distances than gatherers need to do. But you also have to navigate to gather, and there are spatial problems to solve to be a successful gatherer that are less important for hunting. This means that we should actually predict that there are navigational abilities for which women are, on average, more skilled than men. The problem was, looking in the literature, there wasn't much evidence for this. But after carefully reviewing that prior literature, considering the tasks that had been used, I suspected that these earlier researchers just weren't testing the right thing. I predicted that when the navigational task required navigating to gatherable food, like the fruits that you could harvest off a tree over and over across time, or from stalls around a market, women should show better navigational skill than men. And across 6 different studies, the first one testing people in a real-world farmer's market, this is exactly what I found. When you make the subtle shift in the task by making the targets of navigation relevant for gathering, the sex difference that typically had shown a male advantage flips around, and we find a female advantage on essentially the same task. I think it's really worth considering what we have here. In over 70 years of research on navigational ability, this was the first ever evidence of a female navigational advantage. From the prior literature, we had the representation that the evidence said that men had better spatial abilities than women. And I'd guess that this is pretty common wisdom that you might be familiar with. But my data show that this is not in fact the case. And I don't think it's accidental that we were the ones to find this effect. We were the first ones who took this ecological perspective seriously enough to do the task analysis of the spatial problems that gatherers had to solve. Doing that allowed us to precisely predict the task features that should demonstrate a female navigational advantage. From another perspective, we can also think about this more than 70-year pattern a different way. In the absence of a strong a priori theory about what the adaptive problems are that adaptations should be designed to solve, we only have our own intuitions about tasks that we think some people might do better on than others. For many generations, we've had a dramatic overrepresentation of men in science. And while that's starting to shift in psychology, it's still true if you look at the tenured senior faculty ranks. Is it really all that surprising, then, that male intuitions would gravitate to tasks that engage men's abilities, and are thus likelier to reveal a male advantage? Seems pretty reasonable, right? This is problematic, though, for 2 clear reasons. One, it distorts our scientific understanding of the architecture of human spatial cognition. But even more importantly, it has caused us to falsely tell generations of women that their spatial abilities are likely to be worse than men's. And it's simply not true. My largest research program across my career has focused on our social psychology, in particular, the mechanisms that cause us to be generous to others, to trust that others will be generous to us, and why those mechanisms evolved. People commonly assume that natural selection can only select for selfishness, and that only those traits that beat out their competitors can evolve. But over the last few decades, researchers have figured out a handful of ways that natural selection can select for behavior that certainly seems to be nice, seems to be selfless. In my own research, one of the keys that it took was to look closely at how humans have lived for millions of years. We have been making and teaching each other how to make tools for millions of years. We've been engaging in specialized hunting and gathering for, again, millions of years. We've been specializing our skills and labor so that we can trade with each other, and we have long lifetimes over which we can benefit from that kind of exchange. In a world like that, missing out on a relationship that could have been valuable would have been a much bigger mistake than helping someone out who, turns out, won't have paid you back if you can keep track of that into the future. And most importantly, in that moment when you have the chance to be nice to someone, you never can know what the future will hold, which of those states of the world you'll end up being in, how that kind act just might come back to you in the future. That uncertainty and the difference in the cost of those two errors formed a selection pressure that seems to have shaped our social psychology to give us those impulses to be nice, even with those we don't yet know. Of course, we aren't always nice. But sometimes the ways that we can get mean, like when we band together to express our outrage, not because we ourselves were hurt, but because someone else was hurt, also can look like an act of selfless behavior at first glance. If I wasn't the one who was insulted, or whose property was damaged, or who was harmed or killed, what's the incentive to stand up for that victim? For decades, researchers searched for ways that this kind of mechanism could evolve by natural selection. The key that my research uncovered is that while it may only have been the victim who experienced the bad outcome, our psychology imagines that what that bad actor did to them, they might also do to us. And if we show them that we would accept that by standing back and doing nothing, that bad actor might be particularly likely to think they could get away with it against us, too. My research found that the more a person considers the mistreatment of a victim to reveal how the bad actor would treat them, the more moral outrage we experience, and the stronger our impulse we feel to punish them and show them that we won't stand for it. My most recent line of research dives into a totally different area of psychology. How did humans come to be a musical species? We can look at other animals and see music-like behavior in things like birdsong and whale song, rhythmic dancing, and so on, but none of this comes close to how humans produce and relate to music. In my work, we found that music is present in cultures around the world, that people everywhere use music in similar ways and with similar musical properties. But what I'm most excited about is that we've actually developed and validated a theory of how human music evolved. This theory starts with the fact that human infants are born relatively helpless compared to the infants of other animals, and they rely on their parents for a longer period of time to keep them safe. Parents can keep their infants safe by paying attention to what's happening to them and around them. But parents have finite attention, and their attention could be used for lots of other things. Parents and infants are thus at odds about how much of the parent's attention should go to the infant as opposed to the other things that the parent is interested in. When natural selection faces a conflict of interests like this, it sets up the potential for arms race coevolution between the two sides. In the same way that the beautiful tail of the peacock evolved to satisfy the increasingly demanding tastes of the peahen, our theory is that this arms race coevolution between parents and their infants resulted in the capacity to produce a complex musical signal of attention, and the appetite and fussy demand for that attention. We've confirmed the predictions of this theory in many ways, including finding that parental song sounds the same all over the world, that parental song sampled from one culture calms down infants from another culture, and finding that at least some of the genes that control our musical appetite show exactly the predicted pattern of genomic imprinting predicted by the theory. Finally, I was asked to comment on where I see the field of psychology, and evolutionary psychology in particular, going in the future. One thing people often don't consider is that academic psychology is a relatively young discipline, We see behaviorism, one of the first major schools of thought in psychology, starting to get attention in the 1920s and 30s, and cognitive and developmental psychology becoming more popular several decades later. Cognitive neuroscience and evolutionary psychology really have only been around for a little over 20 years. These are baby disciplines in a young field of science. We're really only starting to understand how our genome creates our bodies and how the organization and activity of our brain produce our mind and experience. There is still a tremendous amount of basic science that's still waiting to be done by students joining the field now. And yet, despite the fact that we know so little, we're also at a really exciting place in our level of understanding, where we're getting better and better at applying what we know to find solutions to some problems, and the potential applications are only multiplying as we learn more every year. Psychology has also been at the forefront of one of the major developments across academia that is happening right now, the movement for open science, including pre-registration, open materials, and open data. Over the past decade, and across disciplines, from psychology to medicine and drug research, fields have faced a replication crisis, where it's been shown over and over and over that many of the results that are published in the field don't replicate when you try to repeat the experiment. There are many reasons why a study wouldn't replicate, but the open science movement is a broad approach to targeting as many of those causes as possible. The exciting thing is that students who are starting their career now and getting training now are going to be among the first groups of students that are being trained from the start in this next generation of best scientific practice. And that's all I have for the day. If you'd like to learn more, I look forward to seeing you in class.